This is a quick example of how I've used the writing process model in a task sequence of the Year 8 group. So I always tend to have the instructions for tasks on the screen in a PowerPoint, and I've made a habit of putting the circle that matches the task up so it's visible for the students, so that every step of the way they're aware of which part of the model we're working at. And I try really hard to make the kids aware that things we're doing well before we do any writing are still preparation for writing. A lot of it feeds into vocabulary and content in particular. So with this particular task sequence, we started with a See, Think, Wonder little task. The students were given the 2 images you can see, which from the text that we were going to be reading, and they had to write about what they could see, make some predictions and ask some questions. After the students had done the See, Think, Wonder, we had a discussion about what myths were and how they can carry ancient truths within them. The next thing we did to continue to unpack the topic was an anticipatory reading guide. The students could still see the images, and they used their logic and worked with a partner to fill in the prediction section, whether they thought the statements given were true or false, and then to make a prediction about why they thought that. This was all about priming them before they heard the text, making them ready for the language and what have you. So the next step was I read the text to them really slowly, and we paused along the way so that students could fill in the final part of the anticipatory reading guide. They could check whether their predictions had been right, and then write in what the text actually told them. Then we did a think, pair, share, and the students had to try and work out from this myth, Coupe's Voyage, what were the truths that this kind of revealed. So at this point, I then introduced the question they were going to be writing about to them, and we moved into planning. And these Year 8s, I wasn't sure how capable they were at independent planning, so what I decided to do was give them 4 possible maps that they could use, and ask them to think about, for the retell part of their writing, which would be the best map. Lots of them figured out that a retell would involve writing with a sequence, and so they chose the sequence map. At that point, they were then asked to draw up a sequence map in their books. This particular student did a pretty reasonable job of it, but actually I noticed that a lot of my students were writing way too much in their plan. They were writing like paragraphs in each box. So I decided that I would just provide them with a model so that they could see the difference between they're overdoing it and what they actually just needed to do. Also at this time there were lots of students away with COVID, so it just meant I didn't have to keep going backwards. I could just keep pushing forwards. This student again decided to supplement with some of her own thoughts, which was really cool. We also mapped out what would go into the subsequent paragraphs, and we talked about how the truth in the story needs to actually link back to a moment. So we're making sure we're bringing together the 2 things in our paragraphs. And we also talked about the type of vocabulary that would be needed. So at this stage we're kind of doing a little bit of both. We're still thinking, mapping, and we're tapping into vocabulary and content as well. They then got presented with the success criteria, and we talked about each one, and we did little activities along the way. We had an exemplar we looked at so that we could see how connectives were used inside of the exemplar, and then they headed into drafting, and this took about maybe 2 periods for the student to write this up, and because they're little and because they can't write for a whole hour, basically they would write for 25 minutes, shoot out to the playground for a 5-minute blat and a brain break, and then come back in and finish. So they had the success criteria visible the whole time, so they knew what they were aiming for. And after that they did a self-check, and they were moving towards making sure that it was refined, and then checking for some of their own errors. They then had to work with a partner. Their partner's job was to highlight in the text the part that they had thought was most descriptive, and they told the student why they liked it. So then this, in the circle here, the student only had to properly proofread and really be careful about the highlighted part, because that's the part that they were going to publish. So they reworked that, and it was also checked by a teacher, and then this final piece was published. So it's just the highlighted parts of the text that were published.